Here's the scene I'm going to be painting today. It's a very complex scene. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of contrasting light. There's a lot of different textures. We've got water with reflections. So it's a good opportunity for me to show you how I would go about simplifying the scene into something that I can actually paint. Because I definitely can't paint this. That's way too much detail. I could spend forever trying to get every single little detail. And if I did that, it wouldn't even look very good. So what I can do is create a value study where I'm simplifying the entire scene into only 3 values. So we have our lights, our mids, and our darks. And this forces me to make decisions and to simplify certain aspects of the scene. And this also helps me understand the composition that I have and make sure that I like it, and then I can make any adjustments to it that I want in the actual painting. So there's a lot of textures, a lot of things that are going to be much more simplified so that the painting actually reads like a painting and not like I'm trying to just copy a photograph. So I'm going to be using this as a roadmap between this and my reference photo. I must admit it is a little bit of a daunting scene to attempt. There is just so much going on, but it's a good challenge for myself to simplify everything. So we're going to get started. First thing I'll do is I will wet both sides of my paper with this sponge. And I'll have a materials list in the description of what I'm using. This is just an artist's sponge that I got from Blix. So I'm going to completely wet both sides of the paper as evenly as I can. Okay, now I've squeezed, whichever one you want, gotten rid of some of the excess water from the sponge, actually all of the water, so it's basically a dry sponge. Now I can go back and reabsorb some of this excess water from the paper. I don't want it to be absolutely soaked, just damp enough so that it stays wet for a longer period of time. That gives me more time to work wet into wet and to create those really nice flowing, blooming textures that watercolor is so good at. This sponge technique I actually learned from watching Andy Evenson's demos. A lot of what I've learned from watercolor is from him, to be honest, including this value study technique. So I'm occasionally just squeezing out some of the water as I go, making sure the sponge is relatively dry. Okay, that should be good enough. So, first wash is for the lightest colors, and this is going to be very loose and impressionistic. There's going to be maybe a tiny bit of sky color showing in through the back, but it's going to be very light. Very light and washed out. So I'll probably just use a little bit of cerulean blue for that. Most of the sky is going to end up being covered up by the trees, but I do want some of it showing through. I also need some of this color for the reflection of the sky and the water. A lot of this step is just toning the paper with color, getting rid of the white, unless there's specific areas that you need to keep pure white. I don't think there are any in this painting that I'm doing. In this wash, I want all of the colors to bleed together. Not really worried about the shape of anything in particular. It's very impressionistic and flowy. Because most of this scene is actually middle value. So a lot of this will end up being covered up. Kind of a ruddy color, rusty color at the bottom of this creek that I really like. This is definitely going to be an area of interest where your eye will be drawn to. Just keeping in mind where the sky is reflecting, not covering all of it up. And that color gets darker as it goes to the left into the shadow of these big trees. It cools off. So I'll mix up a darker gray-brown. that's the first wash basically done. So I need to let this dry, and then I will be right back. So this is still drying, but we can talk about the next step, which is going to be middle value. So you'll notice that the middle value is one big connected shape across the entire composition. That makes it a strong composition. It makes it easy to read. It simplifies things, but it also allows for opportunities to find connections between shapes, which is where the watercolor can actually flow into itself from one shape to the other, and the colors can flow together. And that's what watercolor is best at, is mixing itself on the page and flowing together and creating these really beautiful lost edges where everything kind of fuzzes together and mixes itself. But then it can also create these rays or sharp edges like you see here. Now we get that from painting wet onto dry. But within that, so once the first wash is dry, there'll be opportunities to have both those really hard edges and then the fuzzy wet into wet edges within the middle value shape. Hopefully that makes sense. And the other thing that's important to always be thinking about in watercolor is timing. The timing of how dry your paper is. It's something you've always got to be thinking about as you're painting. And I think just lightly tapping the paper with my fingers, at least this area should be dry enough to start working on. So using my value study as a guide, I'll just start with this tree. I'm just using a fairly blue gray for this one. And for the farther trees, I'm going to make the gray even more blue. You might think, well, trees are brown, but in reality, if you want to make trees look realistic in paintings, it's going to be some sort of gray most of the time, either warm or cool gray. I'm going to start dropping in some of that green for the foliage of the trees. Nice dark rich green. Having this value study really is so useful because I already know exactly what I'm painting. I've already painted it once. Now I'm just doing the same exact painting again in color. Doing some dry brush marks to hint at the shape of those individual leaves in the canopy. Drop in a lighter yellow in some areas, just to add a little variation. I also give the impression of sun shining through the canopy. This green is going to go right into the trunk there. I'm letting it all bleed together. I'm constantly changing the ratio of yellow to blue as I mix these greens, just to add some variety. It really does help it look more realistic when you do that. Do some dry brush here for some leaf texture. Trying hard to preserve some of these lights. Don't want to kill all of your light. We can bring that same kind of green color down to paint the grass. I'm going to warm up the green as it comes to this area, because this is where the sun is shining through. You see that I've left a bunch of areas of lighter value here and there on the ground, and that's because I'm trying to indicate dappled light shining through the trees. Hopefully it works out when the painting's done. I'm going to be adding a bunch of tree trunks back here in the distance once this is a little more dry. Paint these two tree trunks here with their shadows, the long shadows that come towards the foreground. I'm starting to get close to this area of rocks. This is going to be a place where it will be tricky to not get caught up in all of the small, tiny details going on. There's all these long blades of grass right here, here, back here too, and I can indicate that with scratching with my fingernail, like that. I want it to be a little drier than that though. The wetter the paint is when you scratch, the thicker the line that you scratch is going to be. If it's too wet, see what just happened there? You won't be able to scratch at all because the water will separate from your scratch, and then it will just immediately flow back in and close, and it won't really work. So again, with the timing in watercolor is absolutely everything. You have to do everything at the appropriate time, and it takes a lot of practice, a lot of failure, a lot of having to start paintings over to figure that out. But that's just part of the learning process. It takes quite a bit of time to get to the point where you're not consciously having to think about all of this stuff when you're painting. But it is possible. If I can do it, anybody can do it, because I started from absolute zero. I didn't even know how to draw when I started painting in 2019. Very, very little experience with visual art. I'm a musician, but not a naturally born artist in this sense. I would never have even attempted to paint a scene like this. And even last year, I've really leveled up recently, I feel like. And doing these videos where I'm explaining my process has drastically improved my painting. It's like I always say, the best way to master something is to teach it. It's very true. Very, very true. And I realize that as I'm painting this scene, this really is a challenging scene for me. Although it might not look like it from your perspective, I'm really having to focus in order to not just completely get lost in all of these details. It's very difficult to do, but I think I'm doing it. I sure hope I am. We'll find out when the video is over, won't we? So this rock here, I'm going to paint over the top of it, just like that, so that the top part of the rock can be lit by the sun, and it will really pop that top part of the rock out. I might darken that a little bit too, to pop it more. In watercolor, you paint around your lights. Because it's a transparent medium, darker colors are what are going to show through underneath the lights. So if you want a light area to show through, you have to paint around it. You can also go back and use gouache, which I often do. But sometimes it's nice to just have that area painted around, because it gives it a really interesting sharp edge, and it has a loose quality to it that I really love. So I'm just kind of indicating the tops of some of these rocks in this little ditch area. This is a very beautiful part of the state, so I took this photo on a recent camping trip. I guess it was about a month ago. This is in what's called the Sierra Ancha Wilderness, on the northeast shore of Lake Roosevelt. There's this big mountain range that climbs up several thousand feet from the lake. So you go from straight up Sonoran Desert, cactus, you know, all your classic desert environment, into pure mixed forest, and then up to ponderosa forest. It really is a magical place. It's kind of out of the way. It's actually very out of the way. So not a lot of people go there. hidden gem. So see, that's that dappled light that I'm trying to emulate there. This place is called Rose Creek. And that sound that you hear in the background is actually sound that I captured here with one of my recorders. I believe I actually set it up right next to where I took this picture, but the recorder was recording at night. That sound you hear is tree crickets, which is a fairly common species in this kind of environment in Arizona. It's a beautiful, musical, very peaceful, almost kind of haunting sound that these little crickets make, especially when there's just thousands of them singing at the same time, like you hear in the recording. It's a very unique sound, and it really adds to the ambiance of this whole environment. In fact, all of the sounds that you hear in the background of my videos are nature recordings that I myself made. It's something I really enjoy doing, is recording nature sounds. Have not been doing much of it lately, unfortunately. Hopefully I'll be able to get back to doing it soon and get some more sounds, especially for these videos. I think it really adds to the overall vibe. Hopefully you guys like it. Another thing I'm having to constantly remind myself to do, especially with a very complicated scene like this, is to slow down, because I can tend to get very antsy and I want to just finish it. I just want to be done with it, but I need to slow down and really take my time. There's no need to be in a hurry with this. In fact, if you want to paint loosely, which I do, speeding up is not what you want to do. You want to slow down, which seems counterintuitive. I'm just lifting up a little paint here with a damp brush that's clean, just to indicate a little bit of glow from the sun right here. Again, I could do this with gouache, but I prefer to do it without if I can. Do that back here too. Just lighten this up a bit. Might be too dry, actually. I don't know. There we go. Yeah, just a little bit. Nothing too drastic. Just a subtle effect. Now keep in mind, I still have to do my darks. So a lot of this area will get darkened up even more, so I can really make this part here lighter. I'm going to start working on this area of rocks in the stream bed. The creek was very dry when we were there. I guess it's kind of a semi-seasonal creek. But there was still a little bit of trickle of water flowing, which you can hear in the recording if you listen close. It was a very exciting, adventurous camping trip. The first night there was a giant thunderstorm that rolled through right over top of us, just lightning everywhere. Very intense. Especially when you're in a tent and you're exposed. All you can do is just sit there and hope and pray for the best. But it eventually passed. It was very exciting. So, in this area, I'm just going to roughly indicate the shape of these rocks and try to leave the tops of these rocks lit, just to give you an idea of the shape of the rocks. It's another area where I need to be really careful and not get caught up in detail. I'm trying to simplify, trying to look at my value study more than my reference photo. I'm not trying to copy the picture, I'm just using it as inspiration. So there's that dry brush technique again. Such a useful technique. I use it all the time. It's so good for just getting a lot of texture in not a lot of time. I can just flick my brush, letting it kind of drag across the surface of the paper. I'm also using paper with a little bit of texture to it, and that really helps with dry brushing. Just saves so much time and helps with that loose, kind of free look that I'm going for. And I'm going to use that same technique to get the texture of the bark of that tree. You can actually see where I did that on the value study, right there on the trunk. It works really, really well for that kind of thing. I'm gonna have to go back and paint these trunks pretty soon. I might switch to that actually. It's taking quite a bit of focus to paint this rocky area. So it's nice to bounce back and forth just to give your mind a break when you're doing a really complicated scene like this. Man, making this painting is making me wish I was here right now. It's one of my favorite areas of the state, honestly. It's just so pretty. So peaceful. My life has been very stressful lately, so it's making me want to be here. But doing this painting kind of helps take me back there in a way. I think we might be dry enough to do some of those scratching that I was telling you about earlier, like that. Yep. That's a really easy way to get grass. Something that it took me a while to figure out how to really show in a convincing way, especially when it's long blades of grass like here. Well, this is how you do it. I'm just taking the edge of my fingernail and scratching. You can do this with a palette knife too, but I don't have one of those. And it's nice to kind of get your fingers into the paint every once in a while. Don't be afraid to get your fingers dirty. I'm not going to add too many, just enough to give you the idea of what's going on. It's kind of what I always try to do, is the bare minimum to convey the idea that I'm going for. And a scene like this really pushes the boundaries of that idea with how complicated it is. So I'll get to these trees right now after I'm done painting. I'm just going to finish out this area. Add in some more dark areas for the wet ground, dark gray, something like that. For my grays, I usually just mix up, it's basically a brownish color and a bluish color, so ultramarine blue, burnt umber. You can do that with ultramarine raw sienna. You can use cobalt blue, raw sienna, or burnt umber. You can use Payne's gray. That's already a pre-mixed gray. Payne's gray is actually what I use for my value studies. It's a very useful color. So less highlights in this area, giving the impression that it's damp. Still a few here and there for that dappled light showing through. Alright, let's paint these more distant trees. These are going to be ponderosas, I believe. It's a beautiful mixed forest. You've got Arizona black walnut, you've got oaks, you've got the famous ponderosa pine that you find here in Arizona. Just drop it right in there, just like that. Just one smooth motion if you can. Widening it as it gets towards the base, just a little bit. And we can just go right into the shadows, which I did draw out. You probably can't see it on the video, but I drew out the shadows in pencil. I just outlined it because I want to make sure that I'm getting the direction right. Breaking up that line as it goes, as it moves over the different foliage on the ground. Just darkening up that rock a little bit, giving the shape of it. Darken up some more of these while I'm here. Just make it a little wet into wet, kind of fuzzy. It's not as wet as it was when I first laid it down. It's dried a little bit, but it's not completely dry yet. So that can give you a nice soft shadow within these rocks. Some of that log on the left. Soft shadows are another thing that took me a long time to figure out, but it's all about the timing. When do you put the shadow shape down? If the paint is dry, when you paint on top of it, the shape that you paint is going to be hard edged. But if it's more wet, it's going to be more soft, and if it's somewhere in between, then it'll be somewhere in between. This far distant tree. So when I paint this, I'm going to break up the shape of the trunk to give the impression that there's foliage in front of it. So like that'll be the top, and then I'll just do like that. And I can do that for some of the other distant trunks too. Like here. That's what makes it look like a forest. Is those distant trunks that you can kind of sort of see peeking through here and there. I need the even further ones to be more faded out. So I'm going to go back and add a lot of those details later. So there's a bigger tree right there. Darken that up some more because it's closer. Again, I'm going to break up the shape of these branches and the trunk a little bit where there's foliage in front of it. Scratching out some grass on this side before it's too dry. I'm making the scratch marks thicker and bigger so that gives you the impression that the grass is closer to you when you look at the painting. It's kind of laying on the ground, some of the blades, so I can make those more horizontal. Just by changing the angle of my finger. Okay, we're about to paint the big boys over here, these big trees. So we're going to mix up a warmer gray for these because they're closer. The closer things are, generally speaking, in the composition, the warmer they're going to be in color. That's just a general rule. That's why I made these trunks in the distance more blue. In real life, it doesn't look that different, but if you exaggerate it a little bit in your painting, it can really help convey that depth and that distance. So we're just gonna do that. Trying to paint this in as few brush strokes as possible, as smoothly as I can the first time, so that it's fresh. These trees are definitely the most prominent part of the composition, so I want them to look correct. These are, I believe these are walnut trees. If any of you are botanists, I guess you can let me know in the comments what kind of trees these are. Beautiful trees, very dense, thick wood. There's these roots that kind of go down into the water. So at the edges of the shape of this tree, I can kind of give the impression of some ripples by painting these really small horizontal lines, just a few of them. And for these well, they're not branches, they're actually reflecting these trunks back here. There's more ripples happening in this area, and I really like the look of that motion, so I can kind of do something like this, where I'm following the shape of those trunks, but I'm kind of doing that motion with my brush, kind of waving it back and forth. That just makes it look like the water is moving, because the reflection is getting distorted. maybe you can show that the water is moving less near the shore, make that part of reflection straighter and less school wiggly, like that. And later I'm going to add, or I'm going to indicate more separation between, here, let me just add some in this section real quick. Yeah. You can add, or you can indicate separation between the ground and the water by darkening this area here, and I'll do that later. Adding in some more of that rusty color with my raw sienna. It's actually burnt sienna, not raw sienna. See, that's the thing. I'm not really even concerned about what colors I'm using. I'm not even thinking about it. I'm just looking at the tone of the color on the palette, and I'm familiar enough with my palette that I know which colors go well with which other colors. It's all instinctual for me at this point. I used to have to know, okay, I need to mix cadmium yellow with ultramarine blue to get this shade of green, and now it's all just automatic. Dropping in a few more reflected trunks here. I'm spending a lot of time on this water because it's the focal point of the painting. And water does take a little bit of extra work to make it look convincing. There's a lot of going back and forth with softening edges here and sharpening other edges there. It's looking pretty good so far. It helps to kind of pull back occasionally and just see the whole painting as it is, as one, because it's so easy to just get so caught up in only the area that you're painting at the moment. It's another thing that I struggle with. I can get very overly focused on a certain area. So adding some cast shadow onto the water. Yes, water can have cast shadows on it. Water is so complex. That's why it's so interesting to paint. And you can even see things at the bottom of the stream bed. Little sticks and leaves and rocks. Especially as the water gets shallower towards the shore. You can just kind of drop those into areas that are still damp, and that just automatically makes it look like sticks on the bottom of the river. It's really that easy to do. The fuzziness of it makes it look like you're looking at it through water. It's pretty incredible that it's something that I thought, like, how do people make it look like that? But it's a pretty simple trick. There's a lot of that kind of thing in watercolor where you find a little trick like that that just works for you, and then you've unlocked this whole new technique. Yes, this is coming together quite nicely, I would say. Oh, and we are about ready to add these darks where the painting is really going to start to come together. Everything's really going to start to pop and become more three-dimensional looking. And then at the very end, if I need to, I can add some highlights with gouache. If I need to, I'm not sure if I will. I might add some on just a few of the rocks, just to draw your eyes more to this area than they already are. And I might add some highlights for some of these ripples too. But we are looking pretty good. So I do need to add in some more smaller branches. So for that, I will use my liner brush, which is perfect for small details like this. So this is again where my value study is very useful, because I already know basically where I need to focus on adding darks. This is something where it can get very easy to get caught up in just going crazy with adding darks everywhere, but you don't want to do that. You want to add your darks sparingly. So here's where I can create that separation between the water and the ground. Yeah, so many beautiful textures in the foreground. Pretty happy with how it's turned out, actually. I almost didn't do this painting just because of it just felt super overwhelming, but I'm glad that I did. It's turning out pretty cool. That's the thing with a scene like this. You really just have to take your time and go slow and trust the process and know that it will eventually come together. You could say the same for life in general, I suppose. Just trust that somehow things usually work out for the best, often in ways you didn't expect or predict. There's honestly many, many life lessons that I've learned from learning to paint watercolor, and still learn from watercolor. Just giving a little more texture to some of these areas of ground here. Maybe adding a little more texture for the leaves here and there. Which again, if you look at the reference photo, that's exactly what I did. Just some dry brushing. In fact, I'm going to get my mop brush back out for that. Just make it go a little faster. I really love this brush. It's so versatile. It makes painting so much easier. Just because you can paint these huge areas in just one stroke, and you can get these beautiful little textures. Just like that. Oh, I love it. One of the best art purchases I've ever made. The two maybe most useful art purchases I've made are this mop brush and this sponge. This sponge changed the game for me as far as wetting the paper down. It just made things look so much more smooth in that first wash. I was struggling with things not blending together and just not looking right. And the mop brush along with the sponge, because the mop brush can hold a lot of water, and so it just makes things so much easier. And I can kind of splay the edge of it like that and break up the tip and get even more of that fine texture going on. But I'm not about to sit here and paint every single leaf. I know there's some artists that work that way, but I just cannot. I cannot imagine. Like, there's those artists that make entire drawings just by doing dots, like a printer. I would lose my mind if I tried to do that. This is much more what I want. Kind of more impressionistic, capturing the emotion of the place, the feeling of being there, especially if I was there myself. Those are always my favorite scenes to paint, is places that I've actually been. It's always fun to paint places from around the world, just photos that you find on the internet, but I prefer this by far. Just adding some subtle textures here and there now, not too dark. Just helping portray the shape of this bank a little more is what I'm doing right now. Maybe darken up this top of the ridge here. It just helps you see what the land is doing, especially in a scene where there's so much going on. Having those guidelines really is useful. Just gives your eye something to lock onto. I'm just looking at the photo, looking at the painting, seeing if there's anything else I need. Probably gonna add just a few more little branches. There's an instinct you develop eventually. It takes time to develop this instinct, but at a certain point you just know when the painting's done. And it's hard to articulate how I know when it's done. It's more of a feeling. It's a combination of a feeling and actually just looking at it and seeing what it looks like, obviously. But I just feel like it needs some more smaller details. Painting big to small. So the first wash is the big, just flowing, loose, impressionistic shape, and then we paint the big middle value shape, and then within that there's smaller dark shapes, and then at the very end you can add these really tiny, teeny tiny details, especially if it's like a forest like this. That just makes it so much more convincing, I've found. Adding these really small little twigs and branches and all kinds of things, not going crazy with it. And again, that's just an instinct that takes time to develop. Like, how do you know when enough is enough? And I'm making some of these twigs especially dark, just here and there, so that they kind of pop out. Just a little eye candy. And this is the part where you can get really fun and creative and really make this your own world. How do you want it to look? Don't need to copy the photo. You shouldn't copy the photo. Make it yours. Make it your version of this place. Let your expression and your personality show. See, I can darken up some of these trunks again. Just here and there. And see, leaving that little patch of light right there, that makes it look like there's leaves being lit by the sun in front of the trunk. It's a great thing about painting, you can do whatever you want. As long as it looks good to you, that's all that matters. At this point, I'm not really even looking at the reference photo. I'm just just kind of letting my imagination and my instincts move my brush around the page. I'm really not even thinking about what I'm doing. It's all just flow. I'm just flowing. Well, we're about done. Again, it's just an instinct. I feel like it's time to stop with the details. So we're gonna just add a few highlights with gouache. I just need this area to be more light than it ended up being. And we're at the start. I wanted to make it so the sun was shining through this area a little more dramatically. I kind of feel like I missed that, so I'm just going to add a little sparkle here and there. And you know, sometimes it's better to just wait to do this with gouache, because it can be so difficult to paint around all of the highlights. So sometimes I'll just wait till the end. Usually it's because I realized I didn't paint it correctly, but a lot of the time it ends up looking really cool. And hopefully this will, if I do it right. I'm trying to get like a sparkly look right here. I gotta be very careful not to overdo it. Lighten this up. I'm just using pure white gouache. This is Artist Gouache Titanium White. This too will last me about 7 years or so. It just does not take very much gouache. Be aware with gouache, it dries darker than when you put it on the page, which is the opposite of watercolor. Watercolor dries lighter. Yeah, I think this is really gonna, this is gonna sell the painting in the way that I had envisioned it. Just this light shining down through the trees right here. And I can kind of take my finger and whoosh, like that, scrape it if I need to, if it's too intense. So just dropping in some highlights, basically just where that sun is directly hitting the floor of the forest, tops of some of these rocks. It's just showing you where the light is falling most strongly. Very, very powerful effect if done correctly. Just add some shiny blades of grass here and there too. This takes the painting from great to incredible, I've found, using gouache in this way. But again, just like with the dark details, it's so easy to get carried away in this part. You've got to be very careful. You've got to be very conservative. Sparing. Use the gouache even more sparingly than the darks. Yeah, so I can just go back and play with some of the shapes of these rocks, adding in some of these highlights along the faces of the rock. It really just helps make everything so much more three-dimensional. I'm going to add some sparkle in the water too in just a minute. I really like making things sparkle. It's one of my favorite things to do. I just really love light and how it interacts with the world and how it plays with our emotions. Light is so powerful, and we can't even see most of it. Most of it is completely invisible to us. We only see a tiny fraction of the entire electromagnetic spectrum. but the fraction we can see can be just so stunning, so beautiful. Maybe on the top of this log just a little bit, just like that. So you can kind of see the light follows in that direction, just based on where I'm putting the highlights. And this, again, just helps lead your eye into the area that I want you to focus on. Just a few light blades of grass, just a few. I think I'm gonna stop with the rocks because I'll just keep going all day if I don't. Now, let's do some splatter. Just in the middle area. Just like that. Maybe just a few little marks on the water. Just further enhancing the effect of those ripples by doing this. I think that is just about a finished painting. So I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you learned something. Let me know what you thought in the comments. Hope to see you on the next one.